Welcome to the Connor's Corner segment of Ask the Lawyer. Many of you know we talk about history, particularly the Civil War, and we're very pleased right now. We have Jonathan Horn, who was formerly a speechwriter for President Bush, but he's written a book about Robert E. Lee, the man who would not be Washington. How are you doing today, Jonathan?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
The man who would not be Washington. How did you get that title?
Well, the title is actually a reference to this nickname that we have for George Washington. We often know George Washington as the man who would not be king because he made his decision after the Revolutionary War not to accept a crown. Well, Robert E. Lee also made a choice at the beginning of the Civil War. People don't realize that leaders on both sides of the Civil War wanted him for high command. And one of the things they drew great significance from was his connections to George Washington. Robert E. Lee was the son of George Washington's most famous eulogist, the person who had written the words "first in war, first in peace," and "first in the hearts of his countrymen," which of course are still the words that we associate with George Washington today. And Robert E. Lee had actually married the daughter of George Washington's adopted son. And on the eve of the Civil War, an emissary for Abraham Lincoln actually called Lee to Washington and said, "Take command of the main Union Army being raised to crush secession." And it actually appealed to Lee as the, quote, the representative of the Washington family.
Obviously, Robert E. Lee didn't take command. What was in his mind in making that decision?
So what's so fascinating is that Robert E. Lee personally opposed secession. He actually thought that secession was a violation of the country as the founding fathers had set it up. But he had a loyalty to his native state of Virginia, and he couldn't imagine going to war against Virginia. So he gets this offer of command from this emissary for Abraham Lincoln, and he immediately turns it down. And his mentor in the military, who actually is also a Virginian who's going to side with the Union, tells Lee that he has made the greatest mistake of his life.
Now, who was that mentor?
That mentor was Winfield Scott, and Lee had served under him during the Mexican-American War. And during that war, Winfield Scott had said that Lee was the finest soldier he had ever seen in the field. So his military talent at this time was well known.
Right, because Robert E. Lee almost became an overnight celebrity from his exploits in the Mexican War.
Right, exactly. He was especially in military circles. People knew that he had talents that were unusual.
What was Robert E.'s rank at the very beginning of the war?
He was a colonel in the U.S. Army when he resigned, and actually his final promotion in the Army actually, ironically, comes from Abraham Lincoln.
So Abraham Lincoln promoted him to colonel?
Right, exactly. He was a lieutenant colonel, and he actually has an opportunity to meet Lincoln at the White House, along with a number of other Army officers, and Lincoln offers and Lee accepts the promotion to colonel.
At that time, did Lee know that he was going to fight against the Union in a couple of months?
No, he didn't know that, and he actually had been sort of telling himself that somehow this all was going to be avoided and that Lincoln wanted peace, and somehow things were going to work out. Of course, it sounds hard for us to imagine today because we know those chain of events that were going to lead to civil war and were going to lead to the Fort Sumter crisis and then to Lincoln calling out troops and then Lee getting this offer of command. But Lee didn't know how this all was going to play out when he was living it.
So if we go back in time, when did Robert E. Lee make his decision?
This is April 1861, and so he gets this offer of command, and then he turns it down. He then goes back to where he lives with his wife at Arlington House, which is that great pillared mansion overlooking Washington today, and of course, it's now a cemetery. And then he resigns his commission in the Union Army, and his wife actually describes that resignation as the severest struggle of Lee's life because he's served in the Army for 3 decades. And then 3 days after resigning, he heads to Richmond and accepts command of Virginia's armed forces. And the people in Richmond at the convention very much welcome Lee also as first in war, and they say they hope he'll be first in peace and first in the hearts of his countrymen, which of course is an allusion to George Washington.
Let me ask you something. Doesn't it seem a little bit strange that Robert E. Lee is a commissioned United States officer, and 3 days later he's commanding the forces of Virginia?
Yes, it's very difficult for us to be able to put together. But in terms of Lee, and he has a very sort of engineering, mathematical mind, it's all quite logical. He can't fight against Virginia, so he's going to resign his commission. And then he's going to, basically, he says, my first duty is always to my state. And then he gets this summons to Richmond, and he feels obliged to go, and he finds out that he's being asked to take command of Virginia's armed forces, and he accepts. It is very hard, I think, for us to understand, because the Civil War in some way has settled this in our minds that we are first and foremost Americans.
Do you have any insight or ideas how George Washington, let's say how Light Horse Harry Lee, how would they feel with the same circumstances? And I know it's very difficult, but do you have any insight how they may have felt?
Right, and this is actually something that was being actively debated during the Civil War, and especially in the beginning of the Civil War, right in the lead-up to the Civil War. Leaders on both sides are claiming George Washington would have supported their position. On the secessionist side, you have people pointing out that George Washington was a revolutionary. He led a revolution against the Union with the British. On the Union side, you have people pointing to George Washington's farewell address, where George Washington had said, "I want you to be Americans above anything else, and always put your Union above any local loyalty." And Robert E. Lee actually hears these arguments, and he's actually reading a book about George Washington on the eve of the Civil War, and he concludes that George Washington would have condemned secession. So that's Lee's position in 1861. He actually revises his views after the war a little bit and takes a slightly different angle on it. But before the war, he thought George Washington would have opposed secession.
Any insights how his father would have felt about the issue?
Right, and so his father also had, we have statements from his father that people can take and pull and cherry pick arguments. His father very much opposed a series of resolutions that had come out late in the 18th century that sort of were seen as milestones on perhaps the road to eventual secession and nullification, and he opposed those very adamantly. So there is reason to believe that perhaps Light Horse Harry Lee would have also opposed secession, though it's, again, we can't completely answer any of these questions because they're all counterfactuals, and Light Horse Harry Lee's career had some inconsistencies in it.
Well, let me ask you this as a conclusion. How come Winfield Scott and let's say George Thomas, Virginians, they stay loyal to the Union? Robert E. Lee decides to go with his native state of Virginia. What's the difference between those people?
Right, so it's just this fundamental difference of opinion. Winfield Scott is the great example because he really is Lee's mentor in the military. He's the person who Lee looks up to most, and he's also a Virginian. And his view is he's spent so much time, I think, as part of the military, as he spent a lot of time traveling around the country. He just views himself as an American, and he makes the decision to stay with the Union. And Lee makes this decision to go against the Union that George Washington created. So it just comes down to where Lee felt his first loyalty was due.
Okay, well, we need to take a short break. You're listening to Ask the Lawyer with me, Mike Connors. My guest right now is Jonathan Horn, and we're talking about his biography of Robert E. Lee, the man who would not be Washington. We'll be right back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back to the Connors Corner segment of Ask the Lawyer. We're talking to Jonathan Horn, formerly a speechwriter for President George W. Bush, and we've been talking about his latest book, Robert E. Lee, the man who would not be Washington. Now, we left off where Lee made the decision to join the Confederacy to become the commander of the Virginian state forces. Give us a brief history of what happened to Robert E. Lee after he made his decision.
Well, the first thing is we tend to imagine Lee as becoming immediately this very successful military commander. That's not exactly how it played out. He set up Virginia's armed forces, and then Virginia's armed forces, of course, joined the Confederacy, and Lee was very much sort of put on the sidelines. His first actual experience in the field goes very badly. That's out in western Virginia, or what we now know as West Virginia. And Lee actually has a lot of struggles, and Southern newspapers criticize him as being not fit for a revolutionary type command. He's too timid. He's too much of an engineer. And it's not until 1862, when George McClellan, the Union general, is closing in on Richmond, that Lee really takes command of what's going to become known as the Army of Northern Virginia and becomes the Robert E. Lee that we generally think about in the Civil War.
Now, obviously, he had a lot of success the first year in command. What kind of general was Robert E. Lee? Was he, a great general, a good general?
Well, he certainly was a very talented general, and he had an unusual ability to be able to take the initiative in battle, even when his forces were outnumbered, and they were almost always outnumbered. And yet it always appeared that he was the one who was on the offensive. And the reason is that he felt like he had no other option. If he ever just let the enemy, or the Union in this case, take the initiative, the war would become a siege, and then he would lose because he felt that the Union would just have too many men and too many supplies. That said, Lee was also very good on the defensive, and we credit him with a lot of the innovations in terms of trench warfare that would become very influential later on. But I think what's still fascinating about Lee is that he always felt like he didn't have any control over events, and that's very much different from the way it looked in the battlefield. But he always felt like he had no options, and he was always fighting this, doing the only option that was open to him.
What do you say to the critics, some critics of Robert E. Lee, who say, well, he should have always fought a more defensive war and have been a George Washington in that effect?
Well, I'm not sure that type of war was particularly suited to the way the South was set up. And in the end, I think Abraham Lincoln understood that to some extent, which is why the Emancipation Proclamation was such an effective weapon against the South. The South was fighting for a system that couldn't really survive very well if Union armies were coming through and liberating slaves and freeing and sort of just uprooting the South's social order. So Lee really felt that he had to snap the North's political will before the South's entire social order was destroyed. And so he doesn't actually feel the time is on his side. And, one difference, of course, is that George Washington is fighting the British, who are an ocean away. Robert E. Lee is fighting the Union, which is just a river away.
No, it's a good point, especially about the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, obviously, we know Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox. What was going through his mind during the surrender, or just before the surrender?
Right. So he has different options. In fact, a young artillery officer, one of Lee's most brilliant young officers, comes to Lee and says, "Let's scatter the army, and we can fight like rabbits in the bushes." And basically, this is a proposal for guerrilla warfare. And Lee turns it down because he says, "If I do this, I'll bring on a state of affairs that will take the country decades to recover from, because Union cavalry will have to ride all over the country, all over the South, go hunting out the guerrillas, and will cause even more damage to the South than has already been done." He says there's only one thing for him to do, and that's to go surrender and see General Grant. So he has this meeting with General Grant, and of course one of the things we know about the meeting with General Grant is just the contrast between these two figures. Lee comes up with his uniform buttoned up to his throat. Grant kind of has a blouse that's not even fully buttoned. Lee has this ornate sword. Grant has no sword at all. Lee has these beautiful spurs. Grant has muddy boots. So there really is this contrast between two remarkable soldiers.
Had they known each other before the war?
They had met before, and Grant, of course, could remember Lee better than Lee could remember Grant, and that was just because Lee was a much more senior officer in the Army and much more distinguished by his career in Mexico than Grant had been. So while Grant has these memories of Lee, Lee sort of, while he's actually fighting Grant, is struggling to remember a single feature about Grant and how he looked.
And, of course, one of the advantages Lee had, he was stationed at West Point, so he knew a lot of the generals who were opposing him from their West Point days.
That is absolutely true. And of course, Grant and Lee were never together at West Point, but they knew so many other people on the other side. And actually, in the beginning of the war, there was a general attitude in the South that Yankees couldn't fight. They didn't have the will to fight, and they wouldn't be willing to take casualties. And Lee never had this opinion. He always knew that Northerners would be willing to fight, and that this war, if the South was ever going to win it, would require a lot of bloodshed and a lot of time.
Okay, Robert E. Lee, surrender at Appomattox. What does he do after the war?
Well, what he does is he gets this offer from this small little college known as Washington College in the Shenandoah Valley. It's this tiny little college that's actually been really damaged by the war, and they offer him the presidency of the college. And most people think the offer is really beneath Lee because he's, by this time, the South's most famous citizen. But he accepts it, and the college actually has a real connection to George Washington. It had been endowed by George Washington. And Lee heads over there, and he actually spends the rest of his life as the president of this college. And his attitude is very much that for 4 years, the young men of the South had fought for him, and he had led them in war, and now he owed it to them to prepare them for peace and to make them productive citizens. And he encouraged people to sort of try to move on past the war and to prepare to rebuild the economy of the South. And actually, of course, we now know that school, which was then called Washington College, as Washington and Lee University today.
From your research, when Robert E. Lee died, did he consider himself a Virginian or an American?
He very much felt, and he's very conflicted about a lot of things that have happened, and he actually goes back and somewhat changes his pre-war views on secession. At the same time, he feels that the war has settled this matter once and for all. There's no more recourse to secession. He does want people to accept the fact that they are Americans, and he tells people who are extremely bitter about what has happened during the war to raise their kids to be Americans, which of course is very important in terms of helping to bring our country back together.
The biography of Robert E. Lee, The Man Who Would Not Be Washington, by Jonathan Horn. Now, just so the audience knows, Jonathan, what was your background before you wrote this book?
Well, I actually served as a speechwriter. I was a speechwriter at the White House. I wrote for President Bush, which actually is great training to write a history book, to work in any White House, because you get to see how history is made and how leaders make decisions, and so often those decisions are going to be expressed in speeches, of course. So it is a great way to be able to watch history play out. And, of course, that's one of the things that was so important to this book, which is the decision that Lee faced and how it changed American history. This is an example of how one decision can forever change the course of history.
Now, how'd you get involved with the White House?
Oh, that was just luck, but I stumbled in, and I had been writing for a cabinet secretary, and then I got the chance to write for President Bush, which was just really a great experience, as I said, to be able to watch history happen.
Okay, in the Bush White House, do you think they had a good sense of history?
I do think so, and I think actually having a sense of history is really important for speechwriters particularly, because one of the best ways that the president can present his policies to the country is to explain them in a historical context, to make the argument that we have done this before. My policies are very much keeping with the way we think about America. And that is a powerful argument for any president, not just President Bush. I know President Obama makes those arguments all the time. And again, it's a reminder about why it's so important for us to go back and study history.
Okay, so for those of you who want to study history, the name of the book again is The Man Who Would Not Be Washington, a biography of Robert E. Lee by Jonathan Horn. Thank you, Jonathan, for sharing your thoughts with our audience on Ask the Lawyer. Good luck with the book, and when your next one comes out, please give us a call.
Thank you, and thanks for having me on.
Okay, thank you very much.